Welcome everyone to the webinar. Today we are launching Livestock Fact Check, the first of a series of fact sheets which digs into the data behind popular livestock facts and figures. This webinar is organized by the Livestock Data for Decisions Community of Practice, also known as LD4D. My name is Vanessa Maidu from LD4D and I'll be your moderator. We'll start with an introduction from Professor Andy Peters, who directs the Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions program based at the University of Edinburgh. Andy?
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of these webinars that are being run from Edinburgh under the auspices of Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions Programme. I'm Andy Peters, Director of the SEBI programme, and of course the Community of Practice LD4D, Livestock Data for Decisions, is run under the auspices of SEBI. So welcome everyone. As I mentioned, this is the first one we're doing. So and actually, I think it's not the first webinar I've attended, but it's the first one I've actually said anything significant at. So please bear with me as I'm a bit of a novice at this. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So, as many of you know, Bill Gates visited Edinburgh back in January of this year. And one of the things he said was that great science is helping to turn livestock into a pathway out of poverty for hundreds of millions of people. And that we have lots of tools such as breeding, gene editing, etc., vaccines, other veterinary medicines, and so forth. But the significant thing was that the lack of data makes us pretty uncertain about the right way to go. And the conclusion really is that livestock data in low to middle income countries is disparate and scarce. And in order to address that challenge of livestock health and productivity, we need a better understanding of data. And the LD4D community was set up as one of the activities to try to address that data deficiency. And we feel already that it has already become very popular in the livestock data collection and modelling community. And we've only been going about 18 months, but we feel it's been very successful so far. But as a community, we must improve the connections between livestock data stakeholders to identify and prioritize the livestock data challenge. In the background on this slide are some of the partners that we've been working with, and indeed some of the many of the members of the of LD4D. But that isn't the whole story by any means, and indeed we are receiving requests for new memberships all of the time. Just to remind you of the LD4D mission, it's basically to drive better livestock decision making in LMICs through improved data and analytics. One of the early tasks of LD4D, and this happened at our June meeting in Edinburgh last year, or at least mostly during that meeting, was to produce the charter so that everybody understood really what the terms of reference and what we're about. And those are to share knowledge and best practice, to broker data supply and demand, to share data sets, tools, analytical outputs and methods, to work towards solutions to challenges identified by the community, and to develop and execute a shared work program or shared work programs, and to regularly reevaluate LD4D and raise awareness of the associated benefits. And I hope you will recognize here that one of the main themes running through this charter is that it's very inclusive and democratic, and we want the membership to actually drive the themes and the messages and indeed the work packages. But today we're going to be talking about one of the specific work packages that came out of that meeting last June, and it's the introduction to LD4D Livestock Fact Check. And my colleague Gareth Salmon is going to give us a presentation on that. Gareth's worked very hard over recent months to put that together, and will be speaking to us in a few moments. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, which basically addresses the question, so what? Okay, we've done all that. We have this information. We have the provenance of these so-called livestock facts. Where does that take us in terms of improving productivity of livestock in LMICs and indeed the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, etc.? And to lead those discussions, we have Shirley Tarawali, Assistant Director General from ILRI. We have Harriet Kasidi Mugera from the World Bank, and we have Gilbert Nakweya, who's a journalist with CIDEVNet for Sub-Saharan Africa. So we're looking forward to that very active discussion, and then there will be an opportunity for a Q&A with the online audience. And at the moment, we have about 50 people signed up, I think, for the meeting. So that's all I want to say, I think. I want to wish Gareth luck in his presentation in a few minutes, and I'm sure it will go fine, and hopefully you will be very interested in what he has to say. Thanks very much.
Hello, my name's Gareth Salmon. I'm going to talk to you today about this project, Livestock Fact Check. So I am part of SEBI, which is Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions, and we're based at the University of Edinburgh. We are working as the Secretariat for LD4D, the Livestock Data for Decisions Community of Practice. So this is a project of the LD4D Community of Practice. So just to start by giving an introduction to our Livestock Fact Check. There are facts which are commonly used in discussions and decisions concerning livestock. We've probably all been to conferences where speakers will give headline facts about livestock, about their impact on certain aspects of our livelihoods and our surroundings. The media are also very, very keen on high impact facts, particularly related to livestock. However, do we always understand where these facts come from? Where did they originate? How they were calculated, and in what context they were also calculated? So what LD4D has set out to do is to investigate the provenance of several popular facts, with the objective to ensure that facts are appropriately interpreted and well informing relevant discussions and decisions. And alongside this as well, we're also able to recognise knowledge gaps. When we look at what we do know, we can highlight what we don't know. So we've currently looked into 4 facts, and these ones are livestock and livelihoods, livestock and economy, livestock and zoonoses, zoonoses being diseases which are transmissible between humans and livestock or animals, and lastly livestock and disease eradication. So we've also looked at several others which are in working progress. This is looking at livestock and greenhouse gas abatements, livestock and yield gaps, livestock disease burdens, the significant multifunctionality of livestock in low and middle income countries, and then also another environmental impact one, livestock and water use. So the current 4 fact checks that we've done are available on the LD4D website. There's a link there, and the other ones we made available once they're completed. One important thing to highlight about these fact checks is we want them to be dynamic. We want them to be able to, we're going to be able to update them if our knowledge improves. So we're looking to promote discussion and promote feedback so that they can be improved as our knowledge improves. So they're not a fixed article. They're dynamic, like I said, to promote discussion. So moving to the first question, do livestock support the livelihoods of around 1 billion poor people globally? So that 1 billion poor people is the fact that we've looked into. So just some examples of how the fact's used. These are two publications. I've kept them anonymous as we're not looking to point fingers at anybody. We're just looking to highlight how these facts become used as almost a general knowledge with no detail of where the information came from. So you've got two examples there. The one on the left, support the livelihoods and food security of almost 1 billion people, but no reference. And then in an abstract, livestock provides an important source of income and nourishment for around 1 billion rural households. So it's just an example of how they're used without provenance. When we do start looking at where this fact came from, and we are able to find people who have referenced, who have given a reference for using the 1 billion fact, it's very difficult to actually find out the original calculating source. So this is just an example. So we had a paper in 2017 that made this statement. It has been estimated that livestock production contributes directly to maintain the livelihoods of almost 1 billion poor people. 1 billion people, sorry. They referenced another paper from 2014, so we looked into that paper. So in 2014, they didn't make the calculation. They made a statement saying livestock contributes directly to the livelihoods and food security of almost 1 billion people. They referenced someone from 2009, so we looked into that paper. Now this paper, they did in fact reference the calculating source, which we'll come to in a minute. So they made this statement that the number of poor people who depend on livestock for their livelihoods is not currently known. It's not certainly known, but the most commonly cited estimate is 987 million, which is near enough 1 billion. So that was calculated in 1999 by this group, Livestock in Development, in their report, Livestock in Poverty-Focused Development. So ultimately, the 1 billion poor livestock keepers is in fact 987 million poor livestock keepers. And this was based on global livestock keeper distribution by agroecological zone, reported by Shirley and Steinfeld in 1996. And onto this distribution of livestock keepers were proportions of populations estimated to be poor from the UNDP in 1997. Now these two sources in turn, Shirley and Steinfeld 1996 were based, the information they produced was based on Agrostat, which is now FAO Stat, with data coming from 91 to 93. Whilst the UNDP, they based their populations, their proportion of the populations estimated to be poor from the World Resources Institute, with correspondence coming from 1996. So what's quite important here is we've got this calculation, this number, which is based on data calculated 19 years ago. Based on publications, 22 years old, looking at data which is up to 27 years old. And in this time, there's been a lot of changes to the key variables in making such a calculation. So the definition of poverty has changed, and as we know, the world population has significantly increased. So any number calculated in the past is likely to be less relevant today. So there have been updates or more recent estimations. So we've got the 987 million in 99. Then in 2002, Thornton et al. Suggested 556 million, and Robinson et al. In 2011 suggested 766 million poor livestock keepers. We can't infer any trend from these values because the different studies used different methods, had different thresholds for what they considered poverty or poor. And also you just use different data sources, so we can't infer any pattern here. However, the question with regards to this fact is it really the accuracy? Does it matter so much for the purpose of the fact? It's just quite often it's used just to illustrate the importance of livestock for livelihoods. And is it enough to know it's a big number? Is that fit for purpose? What might be more interesting is to know the trend. Is that number increasing or decreasing? So moving on to our second fact. Does the livestock sector make up 40% of total agricultural GDP globally? GDP being gross domestic product. So this is another example of how this fact is used. This is a publication from 2012 by the FAO. Livestock contributes up to 40% of agricultural gross domestic product across a significant portion of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. but it receives just 3% of global agricultural development funding. So the fact is quite often used to encourage more investment into livestock, basing this on that it contributes more to the economy than its funding would suggest. And this 40%, when we looked to trace it back, it was made by a calculation. It came from a calculation from Steinfeld in the famous Livestock's Long Shadow publication from 2006. And this was based on FAO stat data from 2005. This was quite a broad brush calculation, really just to show the importance of livestock to our economy and our society. In 2012, the FAO had another publication which gave a bit more of an update to this. FAO stat data from 2007 was used, and what the extra detail they gave here was they looked at low and middle income countries in particular and suggested that it was probably a slightly lower number than this 40%. So they demonstrated some of the regional variation to this 40% number. They also questioned the use of GDP as a valuation of livestock in low and middle income countries, which we'll come on to in a moment. So just to look at trends across time, we looked at FAO stat data back to 2005. We looked at this livestock as a proportion of total agricultural GDP. And over this time, the world average has remained about 40%, so that seems to be a fairly good global indication. However, when we looked at regional variation, the higher income countries' livestock seem to be much more influential in total agricultural GDP, whereas for low and middle income countries, their proportions were down here, between 25 and 35%. So this would suggest that the 40% of GDP, agricultural GDP, to try and encourage funding in low and middle income countries might not be well placed here, because when you actually look at the data behind that average, the number is lower for low and middle income countries. However, this also raises a very important question. Is GDP an effective and fair valuation of livestock in low and middle income countries? This was raised by the FAO in their publication in 2007, but what's important is in a GDP calculation, the extra benefits of livestock, which are common in low and middle income countries, are unlikely to be included. So things like ceremonial value, the value that livestock bring to traction in mixed farming systems, the savings and insurance they offer, particularly important with climate change challenges and increasing environmental impacts on these systems. And also another value to mixed systems is the addition of manure. Now these things are unlikely to be included in a GDP calculation. So really the livestock's true value is not really captured. So GDP might not be the most appropriate valuation of livestock. Now moving on to the next fact. This is to do with the risk to human health of livestock and zoonoses. So of emerged human disease epidemics, have 75% been of animal origin, and overall are 60% of human pathogens zoonotic. So these numbers, when we looked into where they came from, these originally came from a literature review done by Taylor et al. In 2001. Now they identified 1,415 species of human pathogen, which 868 of them was found to be zoonotic, giving you the 61 or rounded down to 60%. Then they looked at, in particular, emerging diseases, and they identified 175 species of pathogen, and 132 of those were zoonotic, so you get your 75%. Now, this was a fairly limited literature review based on 39 publications. However, it was one of the first steps in quantifying this impact of zoonoses on human health. Since that 2001 publication, the database has been updated by other authors, and they've had similar results. So it seems to be a good indication of the risk to human health. And then in 2008, Jones et al. Did another literature review. Now they, rather than looking at the species of human pathogen, they looked at the incidence of human emerging infectious diseases, and they identified 335 different events. This was much more comprehensive literature review with 747 publications covered. And the interesting thing they found out from their literature review was, although 60% of human emerging infectious diseases can be transmitted from animals, the majority of those originated from wildlife. So livestock do have a role to play, but it's also important to remember that when we just talk about zoonoses, there is also the wildlife population which needs to be considered. With the growing paradigm of One Health being the idea of dealing with livestock health, human health, alongside environmental issues as one system, this link between human and animal diseases is likely to become more important, and the appreciation of it is only going to grow. So the last fact we looked into so far, this is to do with the benefits of eradicating livestock disease. So did the global eradication of rinderpest bring about billions of dollars of benefits? So rinderpest was a cattle disease which had severe productivity losses, high mortality rates, and after a long global effort it was declared globally eradicated in 2011. And lots of statements followed that saying that it brought about billions of dollars in economic gains. Now, it's not an easy number to come up with, that benefit of removing a disease. You have to consider both the direct impacts to do with mortality and production impacts, but then also at multiple levels you also have indirect impacts, so impacts on cropping systems, impacts on market access, and these can impact at many different levels in the value chain, which makes it a very difficult calculation. Therefore, despite this colossal global effort to eradicate rinderpest, there is no comprehensive global quantification of the benefits. We don't have a number that says, because you remove rinderpest, this has been the global benefit. What we do have are some isolated case studies, some being regional, some being for certain nations, and these are also of varying accuracy in their analysis. However, you can see that generally, well, these are big numbers, so we can probably infer from these big numbers that globally the benefit is in the billions and the costs are outweighed by the benefits. So in conclusion, what are the take-home messages that we'd like you to think about? So when we lose the provenance of facts, when we lose where they first came from, we lose the important context. Why were they first calculated? And the method, how much effort was put into the calculation, and how was the calculation done, and what was the calculation based on? The risk here is this can lead to poor fact interpretation, and this is increasingly important when facts are used to sway opinion or make decisions. So if these facts are being used in such a way, we need to understand them well. There's also the question that when we understand where a fact came from and how it was calculated, we can decide whether it's fit for purpose, for whatever purpose we hope to use it. So if you're using a fact to sway an opinion or for some modelling activity, you can understand where it came from and how accurate, and if it is relevant to what you're trying to do. And also, the benefit of looking deeply into what we know behind these facts, it's also highlighted gaps in the knowledge. So this could illustrate areas that future research might want to fill in. And this would be a question really for the community, is whether these gaps need to be filled, if there's a purpose to fill them, if there's a benefit to fill them. But the most important thing that I think we want you to take away from this is that we all need to avoid using facts without first understanding where they came from. And if we do this, if we look behind the facts, we're all likely to be in a better position to discuss livestock in a much more relevant way. So that's that. Thank you very much for your time. Here are the references that we talked about, and there at the bottom is the link for the PDFs for the fact checks, and there's also an email address there that we welcome feedback. As I said earlier, we want these to be a dynamic and discussion encouraging arena, so we welcome feedback. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I'm going to now, just before we turn to the panel discussion, I would like to let the online audience know that questions are very welcome. We encourage your questions. To ask your question or make a comment, please type it into the chat. So that's the purple button on the bottom right of your screen. Click that. There should be a chat to everyone, and type your questions there. We will be monitoring these questions throughout the rest of the webinar and picking as many as we can for the panel discussion. When asking a question, if you could please mention your name and your affiliation, and if there's a particular panelist, who the question is for. I also just want to mention that unfortunately our panelist from the World Bank, Harriet Mugera, was unable to join us at the last minute. Andy Peters has agreed to step in, so he will be joining the discussion. First, we will start with a quick round of reactions from the panelists. What do you think about the livestock facts that have been checked? What did you find interesting or surprising? Do you disagree with anything? We'd like to hear your views.
Yes, so this is very interesting, and for my side as a journalist, it's a question or a topic of questioning uncertainty in science and questioning facts to really know where they're coming from and what they really imply. In most cases as journalists, when we are doing our work or when we are looking at research-based or data facts, we usually try to look at the methodology used. And I think that's one of the key areas the presenter is highlighting, because when you question methodology, you are likely to get the context and the basis of a fact and how to use it. So it's an interesting topic and a challenge as well, especially to we in the media on questioning uncertainty in science or questioning facts and trying really to dig deep and to find out what these facts mean, what's their origin and their implication so far.
Thanks very much, Gilbert. I hope people were able to follow. I know there's a little bit of background noise. We'll try to manage that as best we can. I'll turn next to Andy Peters to give his initial quick reactions to what was presented. Andy, you can.
Yes, thank you very much, Vanessa. Obviously, I like the approach, and congratulations, Gareth, on another great presentation. Thank you for that. The point really here is that I think that we all working in this sector tend to quote these numbers, particularly in introductions to our presentations and papers and so forth, but we rarely kind of bother probably to check where they actually come from and what the provenance of these numbers are. So I think it's a very useful and valid exercise for us, and as I said at the beginning, it was regarded as a priority by the membership of the LD4D community last June. So Gareth has actually worked very hard to address this, and but I think the other important thing is he said we should regard them as working documents or dynamic documents, so that they can be continually updated in future, and so that they keep their relevance. But I think it's a great start, and I think there are still some to come, aren't there? There are some more to come, actually, probably to a total of 10 or 12, something like that, I think. So yeah, we look forward to having another webinar with the rest of them, Gareth, at some point fairly soon.
Okay, and I see we've been rejoined by Shirley and her colleagues at ILRI. So Shirley, over to you. Do you have some quick reactions to what was presented?
Great, thank you very much. I hope you can hear and see me now. Our internet went off at just the wrong moment. So I, again, along with Andy, let me say well done to Gareth for pulling this together and for giving us a great presentation. And I agree with what Andy said. This is a really important piece of work. I just have a few comments on the four fact sheets that were presented. For the livelihoods one, I think, yes, a big number is okay. But additional things I think we might want to think about are the trend and, if you like, a threshold or a tipping point. Where, at what point does that big number become small enough that it's not something we'd want to keep highlighting, for example? And we might also want to think about how we're defining livestock and poor people, because I know a lot of the underpinning information there is based on mapping and numbers where there's lots of poor people and where there's lots of livestock, and it's not actually poor people who own livestock necessarily. On the economy one, yes, 40% average GDP across the world seems to work as a global average. But 2 points on that. One is, when we started to dig into this a little bit, we found that in developing countries, there's a huge variation from about 15 to 80%. So let's not lose some of that when we have a sort of rounded global figure. And I'm not sure if I'm right here, but I wondered if all this information is coming just from FAO Stat, and if there are other places that we would want to do a bit of verification, or other ways that we would want to do a bit of verification, given that, well, there may be some shortcomings there, but we don't know, so we'd want to think about that. On the zoonosis one, I think, again, there's just an important message that we don't want to lose there, and that's the importance of zoonosis for human health and the risks and opportunities around that that shouldn't be downplayed in the process of getting into details of the numbers. And on the disease one, it's good to know the impact of the rinderpest eradication, but I would think that we'd want to start moving into looking at diseases that we still need to pay attention to, some sort of ex-ante thinking on how to prioritize, for example. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shirley. I have a follow-up question for you. You know, I think you covered this a little bit, but you know, when you're dealing with advocacy and you have clear goals in terms of promoting and supporting livestock, how do you strike the right balance between, you know, figures that are good enough for purpose and are accurate and precise? You mentioned tipping points, so I thought maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
One of the approaches that we're using in our advocacy work is to present the information a bit as layers, recognizing that we don't want to lose the importance of diversity in the livestock sector in presenting global figures. So if we give a global figure, we've also got another layer that says, but actually it looks like this in developing countries, it looks like this in developed countries, and then still another layer that starts to get closer to what Gareth was presenting, that says, and here's the evidence, here's the papers and resources and things where that information comes from, so that you can pick up an overall number, but you can also drill down and get a bit more information as well. We hope to be launching this on a microsite next week, and we're going to make sure that this and the fact sheets are nicely linked together as that goes forward.
Thanks very much, Lee. Okay, so I have a follow-up question for Gilbert, but I think he just disconnected. So I'm going to ask, well, I'm going to ask Andy if he has any further comments or thoughts. You know, when we're talking about maybe, you know, from your conversations with, for example, investors in development projects, and, you know, you work for a program, SEBI, that also collects data. Do these figures in any way change the way that we should be approaching some of the big livestock issues? Or do they at least open the door to doing things differently in any way?
Well, I think Shirley just made some very valid points about variation and so on. I'm not sure that that Gareth's research actually changes the nature of the arguments, what it does highlight really is that probably we need to be more accurate and precise, and also that we need to keep up to date, really. The other point that Shirley said about the livelihoods, she was talking about, well, that's all very well, but what is the trend? And you know, what are the tipping points? And those are some of the things we need to bear in mind. So I think yes, it does help us in that decision making to an extent. I think the other thing is that there is clearly this feeling now that we have a lot of data, or at least we have a lot of these facts. I'm still not sure that facts is the right word here. It's factoids or alternative facts. I don't know quite what it is, but beliefs anyway. And it is important that we have more rigor around those, I think. And we are elsewhere in SEBI, we're trying to do that in terms of the causes and extent of disease and mortality in livestock in certain countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, in order to use and inform better decision making in terms of prioritization and what we can think about realistic control measures. So yeah, I think all of those are important. Of course, the other thing is, as you know, that we're funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they are a very data-driven organization, and they, I think, in fairness, have driven a lot of this increased attention to the need for reliable and rigorous data.
Thanks, Andy. That's great. Gilbert is back. So my question, Gilbert, as a journalist, you cover topics related to environment and development and have written many stories related to livestock. Can you tell us a little bit more about the landscape of livestock data coverage in the African media, and what are the challenges in reporting this kind of information?
Yeah, livestock coverage in media in Africa is not really a big issue. I can say that livestock issues are undercovered in Africa generally, but there is some substantive or some recognition growing of the importance of livestock and livestock issues in the media. Usually, as one of the facts was talking about poverty and livestock, it is media that has painted a livestock as a poor man's thing. It has really contributed largely to this, and this because of this, the topic is highly neglected. Low coverage. I was talking to one of the editors at cited.net, Ochengo God, and he was telling me he rarely receives pitches on livestock stories from Africa. He rarely receives such pitches on journalists interested in doing stories on livestock. So it's really not a so serious issue as it's supposed to be. If, for example, it's contributing 40% of GDP, that means it's a serious issue. It needs a lot of coverage, but we are not really giving it the prominence it deserves as the media. We just talk about a few issues when there are farmers or cattle dying and such like during droughts. That's when we talk about livestock, but we don't really talk about the real issues in livestock as we are supposed to really cover the issue. I think that's the snapshot of the media landscape on covering livestock issues here in Africa.
As a follow-up question, Gilbert, does that mean that we should be focusing some efforts on getting these fact sheets into the hands of the African journalists or into the media to get a bit more discussion on these topics?
Yes, I was saying that we rely on the researchers, research institutions, and scientists for our facts that we use in our stories and one of the most important things we try to do, or our goals when we do stories, is to influence policy, both public and national policy. So we really need these facts. If they are there, you need to share them with the journalists, because they need to use these facts to tell their stories. Quite often, policymakers and even the public rely on the media to get some of this information in the most understandable manner, because most scientists are good peer communicators. They may not be so good communicating to the general public and even some of the policymakers that we have around. So it's important that you share these facts with the media to try and interpret them and break them down and share with the public and policymakers.
Thanks very much, Gilbert. I'll just quickly rephrase what he said, since there were a little bit of sound problems, but he was emphasizing the importance of indeed sharing these materials, but any other materials that kind of communicate clearly and can be understood by policymakers and the public. There's a real thirst for that kind of information, and there's a big gap at the moment. So I think he sees a really important role for the research community to try to engage and communicate very, very clearly to an audience beyond the normal academic world. I know Shirley wanted to respond to this, so I'm going to hand over to her.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that I think very much related to what Gilbert also said, that conveying these facts in terms of what the policymakers and public would be interested in includes an intermediate piece, and that intermediate piece is relating these facts to wider development issues. So whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals or it's a coalition of those different goals, as we're looking at in various different fora, including the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, it's being able to say, and this fact from livestock matters for SDG 1 on poverty, or SDG 2 on food security, or whatever it might be. So that, because those are the, if you like, hooks that policymakers and the public are becoming, I think, increasingly familiar with.
Thanks very much, Shirley. We're going to turn now to some of the questions from the online audience. There are some really fantastic questions coming in. Thank you all. We're going to start with the first one, which I think should probably go to Alan, and that is, to Gareth. It's from Alan Duncan. He asks, there's a lot of controversy around the contribution of livestock to greenhouse gas emissions. Is there a plan to develop a fact sheet on this? Can you do justice to the complexities in a fact sheet? So Gareth, let me give you a microphone.
Hello. Thanks for the question, Alan. So I think what we're going to look into, so one of the fact sheets which we're in the process of building is to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think one of the key messages that we want to get out of that fact sheet is that there's huge variation in the greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock production systems, and how we allocate the emissions to the function of livestock can make a big difference as to how bad the livestock production system is. So I think that's what we want to highlight, is that there's variation within the systems. There's been some interesting studies by, for example, I think it was Weiler in Wageningen. So they've looked at how the greenhouse gas emission intensities change when you really fully value livestock in low and middle income countries. So that's something we've highlighted as well, that the multiple values of livestock mean the impact of the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product can be reduced. But we're working on that one, so we welcome ideas.
Great. So I'm going to pick another question, and this comes from Ingrid Contreras from OIE, the for Animal Health, International Association for Animal Health. How are the international organizations involved in the collection of data? How can they contribute to better use and understanding of the information collected and shared with the global community? I'm going to put this question first to Shirley.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for the question. We are undertaking a number of initiatives to better connect, if you like, the international communities working on livestock. I mentioned the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock that has a big meeting next week. We as ILRI have been involved in assembling some of the evidence around livestock, and we'll be putting that out again during the course of next week. You may have heard of the Livestock Global Alliance, which brings together the 5 public sector organizations concerned with livestock. All of these different initiatives are really attempting to make sure that certainly international organizations who are talking to the world about livestock are doing so with a bit more of a common voice than perhaps we have done so in the past. And why is that important? It's important for similar reasons than Andy outlined at the beginning, because we really need to get out some messages about livestock that are not all bad news about the environment and health, but that they're real opportunities and that we don't want those opportunities to be missed. So let's make sure that we keep connected and try as much as we can to better align some of the messages that we're putting out there.
Thank you so much, Shirley. That's a great point. And I wonder if Andy would weigh in on this, and especially in light of the recently established Livestock Data for Development community. Perhaps he can expand a bit on whether this LD4D community has a role to play in this issue.
Thanks, Vanessa. Well, yeah, obviously we do think LD4D has a role to play in this, and as I said at the beginning, we've been very excited and enthused by the fact that the initiation of that community was greeted by the rest of the livestock community with a lot of enthusiasm too, and many of the larger international organizations have joined it and actively got involved in the meetings and the discussions. And I wanted to include OIE in that because the question, I think it was from Ingrid just a few moments ago, about that. And OIE are a member of the community. We would like OIE to play a very significant role in LD4D, because I think obviously they have a lot to bring in, particularly obviously in terms of the animal health and disease aspects. So we would want to encourage that. And the other thing, clearly, in terms of improving communication, but also improving data quality. The recent meeting that OIE hosted in Paris on global burden of animal disease, for example, where I think something approaching, I don't know, 80 or 100 people attended from across the world to talk about the global burden of livestock disease, of animal disease, and how one might go about quantifying that with a view to getting much better data on the sorts of things we're talking about here. So I think organizations like OIE have a great role to play in this, and would want to encourage more of that, if at all possible. Could I also, while I've got the mic, just address another question that I saw pop up from Mark? Can I do that, or are you telling me not? She's telling me no, so I've got to shut up. Sorry.
Sorry, I know that Gareth is keen to quickly respond to the same question before we switch topics.
Yeah, so it's just to reinforce what Andy was saying, that the LD4D community already seems to have made big strides in working together as a global livestock community. So I recently went to a meeting of livestock modelers, and it was a really exciting meeting because there were people from a lot of organisations considering livestock. So we had people from CSIRO, we had people from ILRI, from FAO, and all these livestock modelers were agreeing that they need to work together and harmonise and complement each other to answer some of the big questions that we're facing. So just to highlight that we've already seen the evidence of the benefit of working as a community of practice, and it's exciting looking forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. There's loads of questions that have come in. If your question does not get answered, we will send you a personal response, we promise, to make sure that we can follow up with you. So the last question comes from Mark Booth. He asks, does the panel think it is worth reaching out across disciplines and taking a transdisciplinary approach, I guess, to data collection and so forth, that includes citizen science to collect more data? So Andy, I know, is itching to give a quick response to this, and I hope that we can also hear from Shirley and maybe even Gilbert before time is up. So Andy, you've got a minute.
Okay, thanks for that. Actually, I'd seen another question by Mark, which was one facet of that, but it really related to best guess rather than collecting more and more refined data, and that's really something. And would I be allowed to just address that very quickly? Yeah. Thank you. And this, I wanted to mention this because this is a kind of tension or a balance that we've been facing in SEBI over the last months, really. And indeed, as I mentioned, we've been collecting data on livestock health in 3 countries, Nigeria, Tanzania and Ethiopia, over recent months. And one of the things we were concerned about is when is enough data enough, and when is the quality of it good enough to start to think about making some decisions. And we've been having a debate on this very issue about the balance between ever increasing rigor of data versus when can you actually say, well, that's good enough, we will actually start to make some decisions on the basis of this. And we've had a workshop this week, actually Monday and Tuesday in here, where we brought together a group of experts to pore over our own data and give their views on that. So it is something that we're very aware of. Sorry, with that I'll move on. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. So over to Shirley. Do you want to add anything to what Andy said, or back to the original question about the role of gathering data from maybe more unconventional sources, citizen science, farmers, and so forth? Do you have anything to add there?
I think it's certainly something we have to think about, because increasingly we see that maybe it's public or it's all of us are not just making decisions based on facts and evidence, but there's lots of other values and qualitative and quantitative inputs that lead to people's decisions. There's various elections that took place in the recent past that perhaps support that. So I think it's important that we do think beyond just numbers and evidence, and bring a bigger mix in. I also think we need to bring into the mix not just livestock people. We've talked at one time in the past of having a fact sheet, for example, on nutrition. Obviously, if we do that, we need to work together cross-discipline with the medical and nutrition and so on groups. And there's probably other examples too. And that also helps make sure that we get the livestock piece into the bigger set of development issues, which I think is ultimately what a lot of this is really about.
Thanks so much, Shirley. Do Gilbert or Gareth want to add anything? Okay, Gilbert, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh,
yes,
Gilbert, can you type
what I was saying is that we as journalists.
Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry, Gilbert. I'm going to actually read out his response because we're having some sound issues. So he wanted to clarify how journalists are working hard to ensure accuracy in what they do. So they're sourcing, and Gilbert, feel free to type a clarification in case I missed. And sourcing media heavily relies on livestock researchers, scientists, policymakers, and research institutions for facts. They encourage multiple sourcing to increase certainty on facts. So if, for example, the FAO says 40% of agricultural GDP is contributed by the livestock sector, a journalist such as Gilbert would probably ask, well, what do the others say? What does AFDB say? What does World Bank say? What does ILRI say? And so forth. But I think what we've discovered is that everyone's sort of referencing back to one or two original publications, so maybe they don't necessarily have original data on this. And journalists are also questioning, they're looking for uncertainties and they dig into those. I think they find that a really interesting point for investigation, and what do the uncertainties mean, so that it's not always clear-cut, black and white. Gilbert, I hope that did justice to your question. Feel free to type any further elaborations or additions. That is actually our time running out. It's the end of our hour. I really do appreciate the excellent participation and engagement and the time. I'll just turn my video on so we say goodbye together. I do appreciate your time and effort and everyone's interest in these topics. It's really encouraging that we have reached this audience. We're quite a new program. So what we plan to do is continue to work on more fact sheets on relevant topics. There will be a chance for following up on this webinar. We're going to publish the recording of the webinar on our website. We'll respond to all the questions that didn't get addressed. So we'll have responses in there too, and there'll be a chance to continue the chat in the comments section of our website. We're on Twitter at LD4D_community, and we welcome any and all input and criticism. So thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your days, and let's keep up the good work. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.